Okay, the screencast will start on the attack on Pearl Harbor and it'll continue through chapter 24, sections 2 and 3. So first thing for the attack on Pearl Harbor, if you remember, we talked about Japan had been militaristic in the past and leading up into World War II, and they were expanding in Asia. They were taking over some of the smaller island countries, and they had already invaded China and some other countries in Asia. Well, in 1940, Japan entered the Tripartite Pact, which officially created the Axis alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, Japanese aggression concerned the U.S. because of American interest in Asia, because of our markets, because of the Philippines, which was, our colony, and Guam was also a territory. So we have interest out there, and we're concerned that Japan is going to attack that. So the U.S. and Japan had been involved in negotiations. The U.S. was basically trying to stop Japanese aggression, but the Japanese refuse. And so tensions mounted between the two countries, and eventually the U.S. instituted an embargo on all trade with Japan. Embargo, if you remember, it just means like ceasing trade. You stop all trade. So they instituted that embargo against Japan, and one of those things that they stopped trading was oil. And oil at this point is extremely important to Japan because, one, they don't have a whole lot of natural resources in their own country, so they have to get it from somewhere else. But oil in particular is important because they're fighting a war right now, and they need the oil for their ships and their planes and things like that. So it's very important for them to have this. So when the U.S. cut off Japan's oil supply, they basically took it as a sign that the U.S. was allying itself with the Allies. And so the Prime Minister of Japan, General Hideki Tojo, started to prepare for war against the U.S. And so on December 7th, 1941, and you do have to know that date, December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Japan wanted to attack the U.S. before the U.S. could attack Japan. And they wanted to cripple our naval forces in the Pacific because if we wanted to invade Japan, we would have to use our Navy to do so. And so they wanted to get rid of the Navy or cripple the Navy. Just so you know, Japan didn't give us really any warning, but we did have some warnings about the Pearl Harbor attack. For instance, there were a few cases of the U.S. breaking Japanese military code, and they knew that there was going to be an attack, but they couldn't figure out where or when the attack would happen. So we were aware that Japan was going to attack us, but we didn't know where or when. There was another case where a U.S. destroyer encountered a Japanese sub in the Pacific heading towards Pearl Harbor. But the proper authorities were not alerted in time. You know how the chain of command works in the military, and so the word traveled too slowly to reach who it needed to reach. And then the other warning that we got was a man that was manning the radar station noticed that there were a lot of planes coming in on the radar, and he thought it was unusual, but he was told to dismiss it because some American planes were supposed to be coming in later that day, and they just thought it was the American planes. So there were some warnings, but the U.S. just kind of missed all of the warnings. And so the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack. And because of that, the U.S. was not prepared initially to fight back. And so by the time the attack was over, there were 2 waves of the attack. And by the time it was over, 2,400 Americans were killed. So they didn't destroy just the ships. The Navy also has a lot of planes. Those planes get launched off the aircraft carriers. And so they were targeting both the harbor itself with the ships and the airfields to get rid of the Navy planes. Here's some pictures from Pearl Harbor. Some pictures of some of the ships being blown up. This is a map that just kind of shows how the harbor was laid out, and it's color-coded to show you which ships were sunk, which were heavily damaged, which were moderately damaged, and some of them were left untouched. If you look closely, you can see the torpedo coming off of this torpedo plane. These are just some newspaper headlines. What I find interesting here is that this was on the day of the attack, and it says 6 known dead and 21 injured, and then by the time it was all over, there were 2,400 that were dead. These are just some propaganda posters that came out after the attack. And this is the Pearl Harbor Memorial. The ship that you see here going horizontally, that's the USS Arizona. It became super famous because out of the 2,400 Americans that were killed at Pearl Harbor, about 1,170 something were on the USS Arizona. And so now they've made it into a memorial that you can go and visit. So after the attack, the next day, FDR addressed Congress, and he called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. And he basically asked Congress, or not basically, he asked Congress to declare war against Japan. And so if you remember Jeannette Rankin, we talked about her with World War I, the first woman elected to Congress. She was the only person in Congress to vote no to entering World War II. Everyone else voted yes. And so the U.S. declared war against Japan. A couple of days later, Italy and Germany, who's Japan's allies, declared war against the U.S. And then the U.S., of course, declared war back on Italy and Germany as well. So after the Pearl Harbor attack, the U.S. is officially in World War II. You don't have to write the quote down at the bottom. I just think that this is an interesting quote from Isoroku Yamamoto. He is the architect behind the attack at Pearl Harbor. After it was over, he said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." What he means is we've made a mistake. Japan has made a mistake. The U.S. is a giant. They're a giant military power, and they were staying out of this. They were sleeping, and now we're the ones to wake them up, bring them into this war, and we've also made them really mad. And so he's a little concerned that this might not have been the best thing to do. All right, so now the U.S. is in this war. So we have to do a few things on the home front in order to organize for victory. So the first is financing the war. How are we going to finance the war? First of all, we need to mobilize. We need to change production, move like consumer production to war production instead. So all of these factories that were producing things just for consumers are now going to start producing things for the war instead. We need to raise money, we need to raise an army, and we need to assemble a workforce. We need more people working in these factories, especially if we're going to have a draft and send soldiers off to fight. We're going to have people taking the jobs in the factories that the soldiers are leaving behind. So one thing that the government created was the War Production Board. It gave contracts to factories to produce war goods. It allocated scarce resources, so like they decided which factories would get which resources. They managed the change of industry from consumer to war goods. And they used positive reinforcement for businesses like tax write-offs for expanding their production or guaranteed profits, because the government is the one purchasing all of this stuff. So what ended up happening is war mobilization boosted the U.S. economy, because we increased our production, and it restored American faith in the capitalist system, which was kind of waning after the Great Depression. So it wasn't the New Deal that ended the Great Depression. It helped a little bit, but it didn't end the Depression by any means. It wasn't until World War II, when we had this boost in production and the government was buying things from these factories that we needed for the war, and people were getting jobs because they had to have people to work in these factories, that we actually ended the Depression. All right, so mobilizing the American fighting force. We talked about the Selective Service Act, the first peacetime draft. It had been instituted in 1940. However, the military was still segregated at this time. Despite protests from civil rights groups, the military continued to segregate African American soldiers. Now, Mexican Americans were not segregated. They were allowed to fight with everyone else. And Native Americans were also not segregated. Native Americans had, one group of Native Americans had a special role in World War II. They used the Navajo as what's known as code talkers. So they basically used their own language, the Navajo language, to create codes for the U.S. military to communicate with. And that was for like sending secret military messages and things like that. You don't have to write these down, but I just wanted to show you how they worked. And it's important that they use Navajo, because Navajo is a language that really no one else knew. So it was kind of a code within a code. If anybody wanted to break the U.S. military code, they'd first have to learn Navajo, and then they'd have to break the code. So here's how it worked. They would use Navajo words to spell out each letter, different letter of the alphabet. So if you wanted to spell Navy, you'd have to use all those words that I listed under Navy. The first one, Tosh, means needle. So you take the N, and then Wulachi means ant. And so you take the A from ant, and then so on, and you'd eventually get Navy. Not every word had to be spelled out. Some common military words had regular Navajo words to go with them. For example, Beshlo in Navajo meant iron fish, and so that means submarine in the code, and so on. So it's kind of a code within a code, and no one was ever actually able to break the U.S. military code during World War II. All right, women in the military. Thousands of women volunteered for the armed services. Their duties were limited, though. They were not allowed in combat. So what could they do? Well, in the Army, they could join the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or WAC. Eventually, they would drop the auxiliary status, and it would be Women's Army Corps, where they would serve as either like secretaries or nurses or things like that. In the Navy, they could join Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Services, or WAVES. Get it? WAVES. Navy. Anyway, they would just work in the same type of roles as they did in the Army with the Navy there. And then they could actually be pilots in the Air Force. Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP is what they were called. And they would actually fly supplies and soldiers and things like that. Now, this isn't combat. They're not getting in combat flights, but they can fly supplies and soldiers. But most of these jobs, minus the pilots, most of these jobs just reinforced the stereotypes of women working. It was office work, healthcare, or communication. Now, back in the home front, it was a little bit different. With millions of American men in the armed services, the defense industry needed workers for the production of war goods. So women typically tried to fill those positions. The industries would use patriotism to appeal to women to take these jobs. So, like the poster of Rosie the Riveter, that was, showing patriotism and showing women can do it, and we can take the jobs of men and keep the country running while they're away. So this gave women new job opportunities, especially for those who had been housewives. And it also gave opportunities to women in like the lower paying, like women type jobs, who were like previously like cleaning or doing secretary work or whatever. Now they could get a job in industry. Now, women were still expected to maintain their household duties, so they had to work and take care of their household. They were still typically paid less than men, and they were expected to go back home when the men returned. They were expected to give up their jobs. In our next class, we're going to look at a 1943 guide to hiring women and just some of the crazy things that these companies thought when hiring women. The National War Labor Board, this was a government organization. It was made up of representatives from management, labor organizations, and the general public. They set wages, hours, and working conditions. And the government could take control of plants or factories that did not obey the rules and regulations of the National War Labor Board. And so if companies wanted to make money, they would follow the rules, and that's what most of them did. All right, civil rights during wartime. African Americans and civil rights is first. Basically, the African Americans used the ideals of the war to ask for equal rights at home. The ideology of the war was promising freedom and democracy, but they were fighting for that at home too. And so they pledged themselves to what's known as the Double V campaign, or the Double V victory. And it meant victory over Nazism abroad and victory over racism at home. So they want two victories, over Nazism and over racism. And they did actually begin to make small gains. For example, there was a civil rights advocate whose name was A. Philip Randolph. He announced that he had plans to hold a march on Washington in order to demand civil rights. Well, FDR feared that a march on the Capitol would be a huge embarrassment for him, so he negotiated a deal with Randolph. And so the march was called off in exchange for the creation of the Fair Employment Practices Commission, or FEPC. And the FEPC enforced fair employment without discrimination in the defense industry. So it was using both black and white labor in the defense industry that no one could be discriminated against. FDR also banned discrimination in government jobs. But not the military, though. That is still going to remain segregated until after the war. All right, politics in wartime. First is the GI Bill of Rights. This was passed in 1944, so kind of towards the end of the war. It offered benefits to war veterans, and it helped pay for an education, for job training, medical care, gave them pensions, helped them get mortgage loans, that sort of thing. And also, in politics, in 1944, FDR was running for president for a fourth time. He used the war as his reason for running for his fourth term. He wanted to see it through to the end. So he was elected, unprecedented fourth term as president. Unfortunately, FDR's health was failing. Um, so the Democrats chose Harry Truman as his vice president. And Harry Truman, because they knew that FDR might not last through his entire term, so they wanted somebody who they would be okay with being in the president's seat. And so the Democrats chose Harry Truman, and he's going to step in as president when FDR dies. All right, Section 3 is life on the home front. First is the Office of War Information. The Office of War Information distributed information to the American public, and they encouraged patriotism. They also used propaganda campaigns to encourage support for the war effort. They also encouraged people, or not encouraged, it was actually mandatory in World War II that people ration. Rationing is like enforced restriction on the consumption of goods that were needed for the war. So these are goods like rubber, gasoline, meat, butter, sugar, things that they need to send to the soldiers at the front. They forced the people in America to save those things, and like I said, it's actually forced. This is the first time that rationing was forced. In the past, like World War I, it was only voluntary and it was considered patriotic. But this time it's forced. You had to have stamps. They sent you, like in the picture, they sent you these ration books, and you can only buy goods if you had a stamp for that particular good. And if you had used your stamp already for the month or the week, whatever it was, then you couldn't buy that particular good. Just like in World War I, people on the home front were planting victory gardens, homegrown vegetable gardens. They provided food for their family rather than taking it from the commercial farms that were sending food over to the soldiers. The Office of War Information also encouraged people to purchase bonds, war bonds, to enlist, and to keep up production. And there were a lot of different forms of propaganda that were used. There were cartoons, posters, songs, pamphlets, all the same things from World War I. This one is particularly interesting. The He's Watching You one looks like Darth Vader from Star Wars. And at the World War II Museum, one of the curators said that the person who drew this the person who, George Lucas, who created Star Wars, was looking for a villain that looked different from any other villain that he had seen, and he used this poster as inspiration for creating Darth Vader. This other one says, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. It's basically getting people to ration gasoline by carpooling. This is a Higgins boat production facility, and it says the guy who relaxes is helping the Axis, so it was trying to keep up production in the factory. Loose lips might sink ships. Don't talk about U.S. war plans, etc. Even Popeye got into the propaganda. Popeye had a cartoon called "You're a Sap, Mr. Jap," and when it came to Japanese propaganda, or propaganda against the Japanese, it got just downright racist in America. And I'll let you watch a bit of "You're a Sap, Mr. Jap" in class. All right, movies. A lot of movies during this time were very popular. It was a popular pastime, and they were used to reinforce patriotism. So a lot of them had war themes, like Casablanca had a war theme. It was set in Morocco during the North African campaign, that sort of thing. So a lot of the movies were used to promote patriotism. And then with music, down here at the bottom, you'll see the Andrews Sisters. Even music was used to promote the war effort. Their big famous song was the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. Migration, millions of Americans moved during the war. Families moved to training stations with their soldiers. They moved to areas with defense production for jobs. They were looking for jobs. What this caused, though, was housing shortages in some areas and also transportation issues. And there were also turf wars, like the newcomers versus the old-timers over public space. Like some of the people who had been there for years claimed some of the public spaces as their own. The newcomers were not allowed. All right, and the last thing for Section 3 is Japanese internment. Asians had been facing discrimination in the U.S. before World War II. We've already talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act and things like that. But this is where it got probably the worst it had been. FDR issued Executive Order 9066 in early 1942. And it gave the War Department the power to relocate Japanese Americans into camps during the war. So almost every Japanese American living on the West Coast was forcibly placed in a camp or a detention center. They look very similar, eerily similar to concentration camps. They were not like death camps or anything like that, though. They were detention centers. Now, these Japanese Americans held many agricultural jobs, and the government was kind of forced to let some of those workers out due to the labor shortages. And also another way you can get out of the camp was to enlist in the military. Now, you'll hear different people say different reasons for why these Japanese Americans were sent to these camps. Some say because they were fearful of Japanese spies and things like that. The government will tell you that it was because they wanted to protect the Japanese from discrimination and being the victims of violent crimes and things like that, like the German Americans were in World War I. So it depends on what source you read to see what reason they had for this. But in any case, it wasn't really fair for the Japanese. And it took until 1988 when Ronald Reagan was president for Congress to officially apologize for doing this, and they actually gave $20,000 in reparations to each of the surviving detainees because they lost money by being in these camps if they couldn't work and things like that. All right, so that's it for Chapter 24, Sections 1 and 2. Let me know if you have any questions.